Thanks, everyone, for coming. My name's Stephen Moore. I'll be your moderator for this panel. All right, I love Odesa. Raise your hand if you love Odesa. Isn't this city amazing? It's a great place. I've been here. This is my 4th time here. Love it. Want to come back more. So I'd like to thank Alexei Goncharenko. I'd like to thank Lord Ashcroft, the Danube Institute, the International Republican Institute, and many of the other sponsors for having us all here. I'd like to thank the people of Odesa who have treated me very well in this trip. And I'd really like to thank the Ukrainian Navy, without whom none of this would be possible. Quite literally. So again, I'm Stephen Moore. I'm a former Republican chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives. I came to Ukraine on day 5 of the war because I wanted to help. And we're on track. I started first year doing humanitarian stuff. We were on track to get about $3 million worth of stuff to areas impacted by the war. But about a year into it, I recognized that I was one of the few people who had been to the Ukrainian front and been to the floor of Congress. So, and I noticed that the Republicans were drifting away from Ukraine. So I started trying to educate my former colleagues on Capitol Hill about what I'm seeing in Ukraine. And I spent about 25 years using data to change public opinion. So last fall, we did a survey of Republican primary voters. These are the people who get the Republicans elected. And we want to know what they thought. And we found out that 60% of Republican primary voters were evangelical Christians. We also found out that when you told them that Russians are torturing and murdering Christians, people who worship God like they do in occupied Ukraine, about 70% of them started supporting aid to Ukraine. So my colleagues and I, Anna Shvetsova, Carl Algren, we visited about 100 congressional offices. We started a website, RussiaTorturesChristians.org. We got a bunch of stories in the media. And most importantly, we supported the work of a great citizen of Odesa, Pavlo Ungurian, who is himself an evangelical Christian. And the important thing here is Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, was a Baptist activist prior to coming into Congress. So he's a very devout man. And our work, visits from people like Pavlo, were able to, Johnson had some of the best information, like some of the stuff we're talking about on the military situation in Ukraine. But folks like Pavlo in our work were able to give him and other Republicans a spiritual and emotional connection to what is happening here. So why am I telling you this? Why is this important to this panel? Because I also spent the last year pushing back against Russian propaganda. And some of the things I hear are, Russia will never invade a NATO country. Raise your hand if you're from a NATO country. Yeah. Lower your hand if you don't think Russia is going to invade. Raise your hand if you think Russia would invade a NATO country. Yeah. If you see an American here, tell them that. Because there's Americans on Capitol Hill that don't believe that. And so we're fortunate here to have a panel who are going to talk about how Ukraine can reshape Europe in the aftermath of this war. So, excuse me, I know my bio better than I know theirs. So Dr. Hanna Shelest is Director of Security Studies and Global Outreach Programs at the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism, important distinction, and Editor-in-Chief at UA, Ukraine Analytica. Dr. Shelest is also a non-resident senior fellow at SIPA in Washington, and Dr. Shelest is a member of the Supervisory Board at the Ukrainian Institute. Next to her is Ian Bond. Ian has been the Deputy Director of the Center for European Reform since November 2023. He joined the Center for European Reform as a Foreign Policy Director in April 2013. Prior to that, Ian was a member of the British Diplomatic Service for 28 years. Then we have Maria Piechowska. And Maria is a senior analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs on Ukraine in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern Europe program, whose area of expertise include Ukraine foreign and internal policy, socio-political situation, and migrations. Finally, with this, we have Emanuelis Zingeris. He is a member of the Lithuanian Seimas and the chairman of its Foreign Affairs Committee. He is the vice president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and president of the Parliamentary Forum of the Community of Democracies, and I had a lot of opportunity to talk with him. He's done a lot of really interesting stuff. So we've got a great panel. What I'd like to do is like to have, did I miss something?
For my joy, I stopped to be chairman of Foreign Affairs Committee, and a few years ago.
Okay.
But I'm still a member, of course, and a member of Parliamentary Assembly for the last 30.
Yeah, like I said, this guy has a long resume, impressive stuff. With that, I'd like to start with Hanna Shelest. Why don't you, and we'll just go through the group, give about a 5-minute overview of what they would like to talk about. I'll open it up to questions. I'll ask some questions because clearly I like asking questions, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
Thank you. Definitely, we wanted to speak during this session about the security of Ukraine and security of Europe beyond the European Union and NATO. And the events of the last 2 years clearly demonstrated that if NATO and the European Union membership is the ultimate goal of Ukraine, what is definitely important, and that is something unchangeable both in terms of the strategy and the tactics when we are speaking about the interoperability of forces or something like this. At the same time, in the beginning of the war, definitely the main accent and focus being at the US support and the strategic partnership that resulted in the security agreement signed yesterday. But at the same time, that was always the feeling that that is not enough. And that for Ukraine, in times of the existential war, we need to find as many partners as possible. And who can it be? And how we can find these and to fill these gaps. And de facto, I would say that for Ukraine, we probably divided it into several very important groups. Number one is finding allies at the personal levels, that the stories as you described, because you always understand that everything is personal. The states is still about people, and the state's decision, it is the personal decisions of their leaders, of their lawmakers, or sometimes just of those, I don't want to say lobby groups, but those groups that really can be the opinion makers in their societies. Sometimes that is business, sometimes that is religious groups. Each country can go with their own priorities. The second, it is to go with the European small alliances, and that is identification of those, and that's probably been the continuation of the process that Ukrainian took 10 years ago. That's finding those countries that are ready to go one step forward from the European Union and NATO cooperation with Ukraine, who are more open, more eager, better understands and share with us the threats. And here for us was logical all that cooperation that we saw for the last years with the United Kingdom, that de facto started in 2018 at this high level. Poland and Lithuania, for a long time we had Ukrpol lead, but then it's turned from the military to the Lublin Triangle, and then with the new initiative of the Polish-British that nobody believed, but at the same time demonstrated that something unique that we can develop. The same happened with the Black Sea initiatives with Romania, the same been going with the few other countries, and we see these developments is going on. And the third was the search beyond Europe, and that is understanding who else can be the partners and why. That's how, and that will be more for the next session maybe, so I will not concentrate on this that much, but that's how Australia came, that's how New Zealand came, that's how Japan came. And yesterday, let's not after the wonderful news of signing with the US, there were not so many attentions that Ukraine also signed with Japan a security agreement, something that 2 years ago probably nobody could imagine, considering the quite a restrained security options for Japan because of their foreign policy. So all of these we call the small alliances at the personal level, at the political level, at the state levels, that de facto could change the perception of the necessity to help Ukraine and can break some of those stereotypes about which you've been talking about. Because one of the principles of the wartime diplomacy that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kuleba, said during the presentation of our scorecards of foreign policy, he said, everybody talks to everybody. And that's really important. When we understand that during the war we don't have other chances, members of parliament are talking to members of parliament, experts talking to experts, media, human rights defenders, religious groups, soldiers, and that helps to build those coalitions and those alliances that Ukraine needs during the war.
Great. Ian, why don't you take us to the next place?
Yeah, so thank you very much. First of all, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be back in Odesa. The last time I was here was 1998, when I was an observer at the Rada elections. So I could wish to be back here in happier circumstances, let me put it that way. But it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to Oleksiy Goncharenko and his team for putting this together and for inviting me to it. So I thought the title of this session was sort of interesting and in some ways quite provocative. The question of beyond the EU and NATO, I think Hanna said, and I think that's right. What Ukraine really needs is a cast iron security guarantee. And the best guarantee available is the NATO guarantee. I mean, I've been saying that for quite a long time. I was saying it certainly since well before 2022. The problem is that does not seem to be on offer. There is no great enthusiasm, it seems, in Washington. There is active obstruction from Hungary, and I don't see many European countries which are actively promoting Ukraine's early accession to NATO, with the possible honourable exception of the Baltic states. So that creates a problem. EU has what is on paper a strong guarantee, but the EU guarantee has no forces behind it. And so I think Ukraine is forced to look for coalitions of the willing, whether you call that small alliances or whatever. It's a question of looking for countries that are indeed prepared to go further. But I think it's got to go further than the kind of agreement that was signed with the US yesterday, which can be torn up by a new administration, and which doesn't actually give any guarantee that the US will do anything in the event of a further crisis. So if we're going to go down the route of coalitions of the willing, they have to be willing to commit in advance to coming to the assistance of Ukraine in the same way that NATO allies commit to assist each other. So that's one thought. The second thing I wanted to question was the post-war assumption, because it seems to me that we are a very long way away from a post-war situation and from knowing what a post-war situation looks like. And I mean, it's nice to look over the horizon, but just at the moment, I kind of feel that we need to focus on the here and now. There are still a lot of weapon systems in Europe that are being hoarded, but could be used much more effectively in Ukraine by Ukrainian forces. And I think all of the countries in this represented in this room need to be thinking not what do we need to hold on to, but what is the absolute bare minimum that we can manage with, so that we can provide the Ukrainians with the absolute maximum possible. Because we're not going to have a good post-war situation if we carry on thinking effectively, what's the minimum that we can do to ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose, rather than what is the maximum we can do to try to ensure that Ukraine wins. Okay, that's two positive points. Let me make a last point, which is perhaps a bit more negative. That's about shaping Europe. Shaping Europe is quite hard, and it's even harder if you are outside it. Now, I think Ukraine, as a large country with a dynamic, well-educated population, can make a big contribution in Europe. But first, it has to do its homework for getting into European and Euro-Atlantic organizations. Now, on the NATO front, I've already spoken about that. But it does seem to me that even in circumstances of war, Ukraine also has to concentrate very hard on what needs to be done in order to get into the EU. And it's a long list. And you have started, and you've started well in some areas. But let me put it this way. I think the most important thing that Ukraine needs to do before it can think about shaping Europe is to shape itself. What kind of Ukraine do you want to be after the fighting ends? And that's not a question that I can answer. It's a question that the Ukrainians in the audience have to answer.
Okay, so it's very hard to be another person in the line because I would like to say just I agree and that's it, but I will try to add something. So I will also start with this name of this panel, how can Ukraine shape a post-war war? So first of all, my first vision was Ukraine or war in Ukraine. And I think we have to distinguish these two different topics because, of course, war in Ukraine already changed the Europe, already shaped the Europe. The world is not the same as it was like 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Russia destroyed the security architecture, or maybe not destroyed, but is trying to destroy the security architecture in Europe. And it's just we are in different reality. But if we think about how can Ukraine shape a post-war Europe, or even how can shape a Europe, because when we don't talk about scenarios, we just can focus on what kind of influence can Ukraine have and already had. So I'm also interested very much in Global South, and recently I was in Southern Africa, and I was trying to talk to people about war in Ukraine. And when I talked about Russia is killing the children, they told me, oh, children in Gaza is also dying. When I said, okay, but Russia wants to totally destroy Ukraine, I said, oh, sphere of influence, it's a normal thing. But when I was really trying to persuade them that it's really a bad thing what's happening in Ukraine, and I started to talk about that Ukraine has the right to its own agency. And I said, yes, Ukraine has a right to have its own agency. So I think that's why this question here, how can Ukraine shape a Europe, is very important if we think about this right to have agency. So this is my first thought when I was thinking about this topic. And another thing is Ukraine really shaping Europe? And I think that we have to answer, of course, yes, because what's happened in Ukraine, and it's not only because of the war, but Ukraine showed Europe that civil society is extremely important. Ukraine shows us that the values are really first thing. And like I said earlier about Global South, it's showing us that Global South is very important, because what Ukraine do in this diplomatic area is really a fight for Global South right now. I'm not saying it's always successful, but Ukraine is really trying hard. So this is my first thoughts about this topic. Maybe we can go further later.
Thank you. In my life, and actually, I have even no time to analyze anything. So it was always elected political realities from the beginning, from the '89 revolution, when we were so probably successful. Temporarily saying goodbye to Moscow in Prague, in Poland, in Baltic states. And that was main idea that they are temporary. They came, the guys from after Bolshevik realities, they came to our countries and we were temporarily occupied. So in our case, we all remembered Czechs, Poles, Baltic, our successful case of our pre-war statehood. That was for us main power, main remembrance, main argument that we have our lucky life before Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler invaded, in 40s invaded to our part of Europe. So, in case of Ukraine, we tried to do, and Moldova and Georgia, Armenia, we tried to create communications, and we understood in the 90s that the window of opportunity is extremely short, extremely short. So can you remember the fact that we signed an agreement with Boris Yeltsin, Lithuania, on 29th of July of 91, one day after the KGB ordered to kill all our border officers. One day after, agreement with Yeltsin, one day after KGB attacked all our, and killed on the spot all our officers. So the major guys from Ukrainian scene in democratic time, like Chernovil, for example, he was our friend Professor Landsbergis, and friend of our revolution, leading the Ukrainian popular revolution in the 90s. He was killed. He was killed in 98. By whom? By the intelligence of democratic Russia. Wow. So Mr. Yanukovych, such interesting creative figure actually, in the history of, especially can be related to good production in Hollywood, if to do a film about his, how to say, criminal activities. But we came to idea that he probably will sign the agreement, association agreement, on 2013. So Lithuanian chairmanship of European Union, it will be now in 27 actually, after a few years after Hungarian chairmanship, can you imagine, from July the 1st, Hungary will preside European Union. But we were presiding 2013, and we invited Yanukovych, can you imagine, sign the association agreement. How it looked at, I can give you this tragicomic Charlie Chaplin show in Vilnius. Summit of European Union invited Yanukovych to sign association agreement. So he was running in our chamber, you know, in front of all leaders of European Union, telling, don't disturb me, I'm talking with him, I'm talking with Mr. Putin. He's not allowing me to sign association agreement. He will kill me, he told to everyone. So that was association agreement, only small association agreement. It means for Ukrainians free visa, free passports, free entry to European Union. Association agreement, it was rejected. And then Maidan started from when Klitschko, Mustafa Dzhemilov, Boris Tarasyuk started to say in Vilnius, in Lithuania, we are impeaching president of Ukraine. And then revolution started, 2013. So from my point of view, we are coming to the point that the key issue of European Union enlargement is coming related to the European Union even political decision. Few months before candidate status, I can say that in Berlin it was no opinions to give candidate status to Ukraine. It was done on the last minute, trust me. Last minute, the political leadership of European Union, especially political circles in Berlin, decided to give candidate status. Now we have war against European Union candidate member to European Union. It's a war against Europe. We will develop military dimension inside, not against NATO, but it will be military dimension. Well, we need to have that inside of European Union. Will be new commissioner for military affairs, and we will try to convince Ukrainians during the agreements that their army should be inside of our armies now. Even during this terrible war, we are counting that Ukrainians will fight if Russia will enlarge the destabilization process to the NATO and Union countries, and they will use their all possible projects to destabilize Europe. We are counting on Ukrainians. I'm sorry to say in this crazy moment where you are counting on us, but we are counting on the brave army of Ukraine to be together with us, even in the inside of NATO countries, and you are highly invited to all our maneuvers, all our army groups preparation inside of our space. So you are not anymore outside, you are inside. And I would like to congratulate, and especially would like to congratulate our good friends, political friends from Parliament, especially Alexis, the guys who always warned that Russia will go with the war. In all our parliamentary assemblies are sitting here, and after 2014, countless resolution was put down by the majority when the Gazprom made their steps forward with Germany. Baltic first, Baltic second pipeline was established, and our minority in Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, led by us and by Mr. Goncharenko, was telling the war, big war is coming. Not only Crimea, but big war is coming. And we have lost our more 20 resolutions in favor of Ukraine. But after 24th of February, all our resolution, Mr. Goncharenko, is in place. And thank you for being so bold. Thank you so much for being so bold in front of everyone, saying to Mr. Tolstoy and other criminals from not elected Russian, especially Mr. Slutsky actually, not elected Russian Duma, that they are not representing Russia, that Boris Nemtsov and of course Vladimir Karamurza are their representative, but not them. So thank you so much.
Yeah. So yeah, let's have a quick round of applause. Emanuelis, thank you for that. And listen, I've been impressed as a relative newcomer to European politics, and I've spent my life in American politics. That the Lithuanians crowdsourced, the Baltic states crowdsourced Bayraktar drones. We're having trouble getting our people to give a small fraction of their tax money to support Ukraine. But the Baltic states are crowdsourcing weapons for Ukraine. The Poles are spending more on a per GDP basis on defense than America is. And of course, the UK is talking about conscription. And has been, Ian, you may argue with me about this, but I think you guys have done a pretty good job supporting Ukraine. So, with that, what I see is, I lived through this 6 months trying to get the bill for aid passed in Ukraine. I live in Kyiv as well, and so I see Patriot missiles taking out Kinzhal missiles out my window. So I'm highly incentivized to get this stuff to get this stuff to pass. And so if there's a silver lining from that 6 months, it's that I think Europe has figured out they may not be able to count on the United States of America for their defense. And so they're making alternative plans. And, I'd like to hear from some of our panelists, and maybe, Maria, you can talk about Poland, how that 6 months wait has affected the way Poland thinks.
Maybe I just start with some fact from few days. A few days ago, a Polish soldier was killed in a Polish border. It's the first NATO soldier who died on the border of NATO country. I don't know how much widespread information it is, but Russian with Belarus here, they are attacking NATO states constantly. Not all, of course, like in Ukraine, because it's more hybrid war, but there's more and more situations like that. Everything what we've done for Ukraine, Russia is trying to destroy by creating in Poland and any other countries like Baltic states, but also some European countries. They're trying to fight very hard with our support for Ukraine. So there is a lot of disinformation, there is a lot of these hybrid war acts, there is a lot of different situations, but actually, I know it sounds stupid when I say that we are at war with Russia, because when I'm in Ukraine, so it's really stupid to say so. But the situation is going worse and worse, also in NATO states. And with every day of delay from US side, for example, we are getting a little bit angry about the situation. But what is also important, we are also trying to know that we have to also, I'm not saying deal by ourselves, because it won't happen ever, but we have to really focus on everything what we could do. That's why in Poland we are spending nearly 4% of GDP on improving our army. We are really, because we just understand the threat.
Ian, if I could hear from you about some of your thoughts on what the UK has done.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is not enough. You know, we're having an election campaign at the moment where the Conservatives are demanding praise for saying that they will go up to 2.5% in the coming years, and complaining that Labour is saying that they will only go up to 2.5% when funds allow, which used to be a Conservative position, but there we are. But actually, neither of them is confronting the fact that we need to be doing something more on the scale of what Poland is doing. You know, 2.5% is grossly inadequate. The conscription debate is a sideshow. I mean, you know, I have a certain sympathy for the idea. The professional military view it with total horror and think that it would cause more harm than good. But conscription or no conscription, if we carry on spending 2.5% or less, we are in no position to defend ourselves, let alone to provide substantial defense for our NATO allies, I'm sorry to say.
If I can add something, because Maria started from the question, is it Ukraine or the war in Ukraine? But here probably will be correctly to say Russian aggression against Ukraine. The problem is that if it would be just Russian aggression against Ukraine, we would see immediately in spring 2022 a lot of the defense activities and the changes to the military times. That didn't happen. So a lot of countries in Europe still have not been feeling the threat, and definitely all this rhetoric about we are not party to this war, we are just supporting Ukraine. So the changes would be probably different. Why I would go probably that it is Ukraine that is shaping, because it is more about the resistance and resilience of Ukraine. They made a lot of the countries look differently to what is happening inside of their countries. The question that Finland and Sweden suddenly changed and decided to be in NATO, that was not only because of the Russian aggression, but that was also understanding that probably one day you need to make bold decisions. When you started to see how many countries started to develop the resilience strategies inside of the countries, how many countries started to think about their cybersecurity, or to look how many spies are inside of the not only diplomatic but in general in the country. How many countries looked to their economy and energy sectors, because previously it was absolutely okay for them like to be dependent on Russia, and suddenly, oops, that can be a real problem. What we need to do, what Ukraine, because it was the fear we will not be able to do it. Ukraine said, no, we did it during the war. You can make it. So that was a certain, psychological positive example. And when a lot of politicians stopped having excuses why they can't do certain things, thinking that their population will not accept it, when the population, like in Germany, being 1, 2, 3 steps ahead of their politicians, Germany, how they changed their policy in terms of after the Second World War, we never can deliver weapons to the post-Soviet, like against Russia. Now they are delivering the weapons. Yep. And even let's look to the far-right political parties in many European countries. The biggest fear was in countries like Italy, for example, or in France, that they would never support Ukraine, the new leadership, that would be a disaster. what Meloni is doing. So that's clearly demonstrated that the problems were in the different ways, and then sometimes the values really matters for the European politics. And it seems to me that one of the biggest shape that we received for Europe, that Europe woke up from the certain sleep of the wonderful Sleeping Beauty, understanding that bold steps are not dangerous, that the US is not always there, you need to make your decisions, and that your population is much more brave and ready to support, and they really care about values, what we call European values, then politicians would not have these excuses during the political campaigns. Even that definitely, I would say that we're just in the beginning of this process. We cannot say that we already passed this bifurcation point, because a lot of countries or a lot of politicians are still finding excuses for themselves.
Well, thank you for that. And here's one of the things you said that got my attention. You talked about energy. And by some estimates, European countries are importing enough liquid natural gas from Russia to build, on an annual basis, 2,200 T-90 tanks. So that is Europeans with liquid natural gas from Russia funding their war effort to a major degree. So I think that's something that needs to be talked about more. Emanuelis, why don't you talk to us?
During the last conference in Vilnius, we invited prosecutor office, part of our intelligence, to make us official analysis how companies are avoiding and circumventing sanctions, what you just said. So our juridical community, let's say like that, found that FSB huge unit, not Russia economical units, but FSB unit, is officially working, taking on the hook thousands of companies and making them friendly to Russia and making for them feel for benefits, avoiding the sanctions. So avoidance of the sanctions and making a joke from all our European Union and American transatlantic sanctions is a key issue. Either we will put all those crooks to jail, or we will change our law conditions in Poland, Baltic states. I never saw, for example, I saw a company from Lithuania who some year ago exported wine from Lithuania. Can you imagine? Wine from Lithuania to Russia. We have no actually wineries at all. So you have from Italy thousands of companies in Italy, I'm sorry to say, Great Britain, Germany, even United States, who are based on this Karl Marx, if you remember, poster, all proletariat from all the world, unite yourself. So the all crooks of the world are now unite themselves, trying to make business being based on Ukrainian blood, and we should put the guys to jail. We should change our law conditions, and finally, officially put in the Hague, establish a register, and put to the shame list all those companies, and we will do that. Trust me, I'm like a lawmaker promising you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that. There we go. Thanks for that. Now, I'm looking out in the audience. I see a lot of curious faces. So if you'd like to ask a question, I think there's some nice folks running around with microphones. Go ahead and raise your hand. Anybody have a question? Okay, we'll start with the young lady in back there. Nomi? All right, do we have any microphones? Happy to come out and do it myself. Go ahead. Aaron, this will be fun.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much to Alexei. I don't know where he is because it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm from King's College in London, Department of War Studies. And my question to this panel relates very much to European publics because that's a serious problem, especially those countries that are not so close to Ukraine, especially Central and Western European countries. The perception is very much that on the one hand, this war is far away, Mishu, as was mentioned, maybe some kind of agreement should be reached. On the other hand, the war is close enough that if there is, of course, a nuclear escalation, it will affect Europe. So there is this kind of paradox in terms of perceptions about the war. But I think the most important thing, and this is what I would like to ask the panel and also the moderator, because you've worked so much on public opinion, is how can we send the message of the urgency to European publics? Because they seem to have other priorities at the moment. And I think that it's very important to work with European publics, not just with governments and parliaments, but also with the public, to get the public behind and to understand the urgency of this war for the whole of Europe.
Thanks for that. Okay, Maria, why don't you go?
I just say thank you for this question. It's a very important question because we are in this very fragile moment when there is, especially in the Western countries, this fatigue of the war, which is kind of stupid still being in Ukraine saying that. But there is this moment in Western Europe, and also on the other hand, there is an excellent moment for Russia disinformation to work. So we are really in a fragile moment, and we have to really focus, we as in European Union and or in Western countries, even in Poland, we have to really focus not to let Russian disinformation work, and we have to really focus on encouraging our societies also not to forget about Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
I would probably add one small thing. I would not put it geographically. Geographically was very right before 2022. Then definitely we heard in the European Commission discussions a lot that, for example, Spain been more aware of the North Africa rather than of Ukraine. But this situation changed the last 2 years. It's now more about politicians, about their agenda, both domestic and foreign, rather than countries, because Spain now became one of the first countries to sign security agreement with Ukraine. Spain is delivering weapons to Ukraine, and Spain's position is very clear. At the same time, Hungary, who is very close to us, now even excluded from the share of the intelligence information within NATO, what being announced yesterday, because there is no trust inside of NATO to one of the countries. So that's why geography doesn't matter. What sometimes matters is the personal perceptions when politicians are coming to Ukraine and see what is happening, but also when Russia is targeting these countries. Because let's be honest, when there have been incidents in the countries with Russian agents doing some terrorist act, chemical attack, or real spies, I mean, some big scandal, intervention like in Spain with the referendum and so on, these countries start to understand that it's not only about Ukraine, when it is becoming personal to their national security interests.
And actually, let me jump in here real quick because I'd like to riff off that. We're in a world war by definition, right? Because Iran, North Korea, China, and Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia are all working together to cause chaos in Europe, the Middle East, and there's a kinetic war in Europe and the Middle East, and there's an information war that all the rest of us are involved in right now. And by some estimates, the Russians are spending $1.5 to $2.4 billion annually on propaganda worldwide. Yes. And we polled this in the United States. We saw who was getting the Russian propaganda. And it's big among conservatives. They're really targeting conservatives. And I'll just give you one example. I mentioned our message earlier that Russia is torturing and murdering Ukrainian Christians for their faith in occupied Ukraine. So the bad guys have the message that Zelensky is persecuting Christians. And Tucker Carlson, I don't know if you know him, he is way off the deep end, and many other conservative influencers are saying that Zelensky persecutes Christians. So after we were done with our campaign and the bill passed, we saw that we polled Republican primary voters. 34% of them agreed with our message, whereas only 22% agreed with Tucker Carlson's message. And what that says to me is that if you go up against the bad guys, you can win. but there's no one, certainly in America right now, who is leading that charge. So
I'm sorry, you just took what I would like to say before. Yes, that was my.
Sorry, sir.
I'm going to continue. We have in front of guys of, for example, in front of us, guys who spend their life fighting against Cuban-type Spanish propaganda, DNA propaganda in Latin American countries. So, and they, if we will be not together, and only KGB will be together with their network agents, having imperial look from the hill, from Moscow hills, and we will be not having the look from the hill. They will have from their imperial hill, Russian imperial hill. And we, in Europe, from our small Brussels hill, it's about the item what we are just talking about, Ukraine and European Union post-war. If we will not develop our not regional but world view, how to fight Russia, Iran in Latin America, in the deep south and in Africa, and they're going and winning in every point. They're putting French people, French guys from Mali and from Sub-Sahara, they developing network of their agents and influential elections, making deals with Afghanistan, illicit trade through Iran, through Cuban network of agents inside of Latin America against our Western interests in Venezuela. So we should be, if you're talking about your Capitol Hill, we should consider and unite all our groups who are in favor of Taiwan, in favor of freedom in Latin America against Cuban regime. We should stop the idea in European Union. It was stopped by Lithuania, like last country, 27 ratification of free trade agreement with Cuba. Can you imagine? European Union invited free trade agreement opening billions of dollars for Cuban regime in the time when there are 3,000 Cubans fighting on the Russian side against us. How it can be that we are not connecting all those points and Russian intelligence being based on Soviet networks and developed networks now maneuvering and dispersing our shrinking democratic world. Thank you.
Something to say?
Yeah, so I think the public opinion question is really important. And it is down to political leadership as much as anything else. There are a lot more points on which I disagree with Boris Johnson than agree with him. But he did actually provide outstanding leadership on the question of Ukraine at the beginning of the war. And there aren't that many others who are doing that. Would I follow Olaf Scholz into battle? Maybe not. Maybe he would never lead me there. But I think, political leadership is very important. The other thing is the personal connection. Now, you were able to take the personal connection back to Washington. I think, we at the moment are housing a Ukrainian refugee. That gives us a certain kind of personal insight. There are a lot of other families who are in the same position in the UK. But I think the stories of those people are also important, and maybe sometimes they don't get out there as much as they need to remind people what is at stake in this conflict, that it is real people and real people's lives. People often talk about territory. I mean, Putin again today with his, phony peace plan is talking about territory. It's, I want these bits of Ukraine. But it's about people fundamentally. And I think sometimes in our political discourse and in our media discourse, we concentrate too much on this field going backwards and forwards and not on the people's lives who are being ruined.
Well, and just to add to that, on our polling, it shows that when you talk about any territory, then Americans are much more likely to support Ukraine's to continue to fight. All right, who else?
Thank you. Thank you for your speeches. My name is Joseph Rabin. I'm a geopolitical risks advisor, and I would like to address an elephant in the room, and that is, yes, Ukraine can positively, or the war in Ukraine can positively shape European politics, but it also shapes European politics in a negative fashion. For instance, our colleague from Poland would know, who could talk about that. The whole campaign in Poland, pre-electoral campaign, was just based about how we don't want to help Ukraine anymore. And it was the strongest message. We saw populist forces across the Europe rising, and most of these populists on left and right are saying we don't want to help Ukraine anymore, which is a problem. And I would like to know, how would you deal with this issue? Because I think you're right in saying that this is an existential conflict, but we see that from the brinks of the political power, there are these messages, and they are gaining a lot of momentum.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to say it was not about that we don't want to help Ukraine. It was a completely different story. It was, yes, there was an issue of a grain of Ukraine, but it was, the whole discussion was not about not helping Ukraine anymore. It was much more complicated. We can discuss it maybe later, but it was not about not helping Ukraine. But the fact is that there was a Ukrainian question deep inside it, but it was not the main thing.
Great. Okay, Eric, you have a question?
Well, first, Eric from the United States. We work from the Human Rights Foundation in Cuba. I think that, Professor, your question was phenomenal because, in my opinion, this war is propaganda. And there's one word that I think that nobody mentioned that I think you touched up on it, and the word is framing. The way that you frame the message is super important. I think the Israelis are doing that well now against the Iranians, and they're working on that. The information war, the Russians are doing a great job in Latin America through Cubans with Prensa Latina, for example, in framing the message in a certain way, where I think us as a Western society, we have differences of opinion, but I think if we all come together and unite and frame the message in a certain way, I think we would be a little bit stronger against the Russians. And that, their propaganda is phenomenal. So I just wanted to make that point. Framing is important.
Awesome. Anybody have anything to respond to that?
Just very briefly, what we realized when talking at a lot of visits, both in Europe and in the so-called global south, sometimes we understand the same things, but we are naming them differently. And now the task of Ukraine is to find proper words, because when you speak about the European values, or values of the human rights, unfortunately in many countries around the globe, that don't resonate. But when you start to speak with them about anti-colonial war, or you already have some additional countries over there. But at the same time, you're speaking in Africa about anti-colonial war, and they are saying, you're white, you cannot be a colony. So even here, the same message is not working. And then you go even deeper to this and saying, okay, we are fighting for the rules-based order because Ukraine being attacked by the nuclear power, the permanent member of the Security Council. How do you feel in case you, a small, medium country, would be attacked like this? And here we found even more supporters. But at the same time, unfortunately, that is the positive and negative about Ukraine. We would like to demonstrate ourselves as a European state. We are a European state, and we are talking that is war in Europe, and because of this, a lot of countries around the globe are getting like, so that's your European business. We should not be involved. That's too far. And that's what Russia is playing wonderfully. It doesn't matter how we frame it, but they are building their narratives not the last 2 years. They are building them for the last 30 years, that they are still those anti-imperialistic, helping with the anti-colonialism, helping with the revolutions, wherever. And unfortunately, that came that deep inside of the minds, a lot of people from Asia to Latin America, that we would need decades to break these stereotypes, to find the topics that can be important for each and particular country or audience. And also, I can't imagine what amount of money we may need for this, because as you said, Russians are spending almost 2 billion for propaganda. We need this 2 billion for war and for the air defense. And that's probably the moment when we need our friends around the world also to speak on behalf of us, because when Syrians are talking about the Russian war crimes in the Middle East, it has much stronger effect than when even Ukrainians are talking about this.
Yes.
Emanuelis, you wanted to contribute.
Yes, shortly. Eric Cortelli's remark was essential. That way we should be together on the Capitol Hill, trying to create majority. Can you imagine, Mr. Moore, 134 members of Congress, mostly fellow Republicans, and you are and me, we are from the same circles. A Republican voted against $61 billion delayed support to Ukraine. How it become possible means we are not working enough together with Latin Americans, with pro-Taiwanese people. Well, pro-Taiwanese people, it's more like 170 members of Congress in the caucus of Taiwan. So we are not working with the guys who are inside, and actually members of Ukrainian parliament, not only Mr. Zelensky, who is a brilliant speaker appearing in the Congress, but Mr. Goncharenko, the bold and fantastic people who are here together with us from parliament, like Mereshko and other, they should be making their speeches in committees of United States Congress, in the groups, avoiding the effect what was created by Freedom Caucus with extreme guys who gain 134 votes against the main last eight, trying to blackmail Speaker of the Parliament of United States Congress, Representative House. So in this case, we should unite all our forces for Freedom Course. And Freedom Course is Ukraine. And the European Union, excluding the case of Hungary, who is still blackmailing us in every corner, we should unite our forces on Capitol Hill to be together in trying to dismantle avoidance of the sanctions, to be together defending our interests in Latin America, in Africa, in Deep South, together with Australia and Japan and other democracies, and being together in every field. But that means being together with Ukraine. Well, from our point of view, we have won our revolutions in 1990, and Ukraine continued to do the same what it was done in Czech Republic, Poland, Baltic states, liberating from the post-Soviet rule with this remerged Putin-like inheriting this KGB order. So in this case, we have an extremely bold case of Ukraine and freedom fighting. We should remerge with freedom fighting ideas and saying not Sandinistas, but we, those who won anti-communist revolutions in the Baltic, in Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in other places, we have right to say who is freedom fighter. Not Hamas actually is a freedom fighter. To the hell, I'm sorry to say. Yes, I would like to say that freedom fighters are Ukrainians, and we are on their side. It's extremely crystal clear case. Thank you.
We're all freedom fighters in the global information war. All right, we got time for one more question. I'm going to have it be from you. It needs to be quick. I want 30 seconds each from each of our panelists, because I've been told by the organizers there's a pent-up demand in this room to get back to that good Odesa wine. So one more question.
Thank you. Honorable Ambassador, do you know what that 61 billion bill that you're saying was voted down by the Republicans called? It wasn't the assistance to Ukraine. Do you know that $10 billion in that bill was for Hamas? And that is one of the main reasons why it was voted down. And then when it was re-voted again, that $10 billion for Gaza was stricken down.
All right, we kind of gotten off track a little bit talking about Hamas, but listen, I'd like to take just a short time from each of our panelists just to wrap up.
There is another question behind you.
All right, do we have an actual question? All right, you, sir.
I'll make it quick. Michael Butzerkio, I'm Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Global Affairs Analyst and contributor to CNN.com. Quick question. This is really important. You guys were talking about Russia propaganda and everything, but also Ukraine needs to get its house in order in terms of corruption, but also, I would argue, in terms of the media space. If you talk to Sevga Musayeva, Natalia Sedlatska, people like that who run media organizations here, the media situation here is in dire straits. Not one time at the, I'll be quick, Ukraine Reform Conference did this come up. Do you feel that it's really important for Ukraine to take concrete steps to help rebuild the media sector? Because a lot of people will argue is that if it doesn't, it's not going to be in shape to become further part of Europe, and it's not going to be able to battle corruption properly. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Even that definitely domestic politics is not the matter of this session, but to make it broader, Ukraine appeared in a very difficult situation. A lot of the decisions that had been made in the very first days of the war were the war necessity and the martial law necessity. However, at that time, there were no feeling that this war is for long. So even the population, if we look to the polls, they were okay with limiting some of their rights, probably democratic rights, because everything was important for the war. The longer war continues, that always will be a dilemma for society, for politicians, for economy. Not only what is the priority, because security always will be the priority number one, but also how to normalize those decisions that were necessary in the beginning of the war, how to return back to the democratic processes that would not jeopardize security. Media sphere that you described is one of those where the necessity of the first days proved that was important. After 2.5 years, it's definitely need a certain revision of understanding what is the necessity nowadays.
Ian.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going to find it hard to comment on the media scene because I don't know the Ukrainian media scene well enough. What do I want to say as my kind of parting shot? I mean, it seems to me that Ukraine did a very good job in the early stages of the war in gathering support around Europe. Inevitably, over time, people start thinking, I've heard all these messages before. And you need constantly to reshape the messages. The success in the Black Sea is actually a good message because people like to have something that sounds like success, not like constant setbacks. But at the same time, you can't lose sight of the human suffering, and I think we are sometimes losing sight of that. So, you know, there are probably communications experts in this room who can think of how to help Ukraine reshape some of the messages to get a renewed focus on this issue so that people don't just think, I've heard this before.
Just two very quick comments. First on this media scene. So fortunately we live in the world where we have internet. And second thing that I want to just refer to this question about the grain and situation in Poland, that it's kind of distraction, but whatever you think, that Poland understands the situation in Ukraine, Poland understands the threat from Russia, and will always be on Ukrainian side.
Okay. So,
And a quick one.
thank you for your last remark. I used to have that. So in this case, we are in country of freedom, and from our point of view, we will understand prolongness of the function of the parliament of Ukraine, not having now currently elections and not having elections for president office. Well, Baltic states were temporarily occupied for 50 years. United States never recognized the Baltic occupation, and we have our government in exile in United States, and they now cannot have anything related to luxury of the everyday simple life what we have. So for that reason, they are in military shape, and we should be backing their internal conditions. Coming back to small issues, I have a letter just now. I would like to bring the letter to Mr. Goncharenko from Crimea Tatars and Mustafa Jamilov. They're terribly, I'm sorry to say, I have right to say, being a Jewish guy supporting this fantastic Muslim group in Crimea who is tortured using the racist mechanism and humiliated through the mockery of Russian FSB machine inside of Crimea. And we should support those extremely loyal citizens, the indigenous citizens of Crimea. Mr. Goncharenko, there is a letter to you, and they would like to have that disperse the letter about their terrible shape under Russian occupation. If I would like to remember, for those who don't know, they were deported in Joseph Stalin time, totally all outside to Kazakhstan and other places. And I would like to show the letter of support for Crimea Tatars who are now in terrible shape in Crimea. And on the end to say that we trust in your democracy inside. We trust that opposition guys like Mr. Goncharenko now is leading our Congress, and we trust that you will have always option in your great parliament for opposition voice. And that is visible, and I'm extremely proud that you are from opposition, Mr. Goncharenko. Thank you.
And I'll add just one thing, talking about what Ian talked about, is that in the United States, we have kind of two sorts of media. And in the conservative media, there's a lot of Russian influence. And we, in fact, tested among our polling that 34% of Republican primary voters agreed with at least one demonstrably false and a statement originating from Russia, Russian propaganda. And so we have two kinds of media. We have the conservative media, which has this problem of Russian propaganda. Fortunately, we can fight that because there's ways you can do that with messaging. The harder part is that the rest of the media, what they say is, today something blew up in Ukraine. And that is the coverage that comes out of Ukraine. And so most of my friends are either influenced by the Russian propaganda, or they say, oh, can you get food in Kyiv? You know, so they don't have a sense. All they hear every day is that today something blew up in Ukraine. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists. I learned a lot. And again, I'd like to go back to thanking Mr. Goncharenko and our sponsors, and thank all of you. You're very brave for being here.